In the early 1970s, America was changing, and not for the better. Inflation was rising, trust in institutions was falling, and crime was no longer something whispered about in back alleys. It was becoming bold, organized, and smarter. In California, banks stood like concrete fortresses, symbols of wealth and power in a nervous nation. And among them was one institution that believed itself untouchable: the United California Bank. This was not just any bank. United California Bank handled enormous sums of money for businesses, wealthy individuals, and corporations. Its downtown branch wasn't famous for its architecture or customer service. It was famous for one thing: only its vault. Engineers claimed it was earthquake-resistant, fireproof, and virtually impossible to break into. Built with thick reinforced concrete and steel, it was designed to survive disasters far worse than thieves. To the public, it was just another bank. To professionals in the criminal underworld, it was a challenge. In the winter of 1972, while customers walked in and out every day, depositing checks and withdrawing cash, no one suspected they were being watched. Not by a nervous amateur, not by a reckless gang, but by men who were patient, experienced, and dangerous in a quiet way. These men didn't rush. They didn't carry guns into the lobby or smash windows in the middle of the night. Instead, they stood across the street, sat in nearby offices, and blended into the city like everyone else. They studied routines, timings, human behavior. They understood one simple truth: banks don't fail because of walls. They fail because of people. United California Bank ran like clockwork. Guards arrived and left at the same times. Cleaning crews followed predictable schedules. Alarm systems were tested regularly but rarely changed. To most people, that meant security. To the right minds, it meant patterns, and patterns can be exploited. At the same time, Los Angeles was filled with men who had lived their lives on the edge of the law. Older criminals who had seen younger ones get caught because they were loud, greedy, or impatient. These men believed in something different. They believed the perfect crime wasn't fast, it was slow. It wasn't violent, it was invisible. Somewhere in the city, conversations were happening in low voices. Names were exchanged carefully. Trust was tested over time. And one idea kept returning again and again. If any bank could be beaten without force, it was United California Bank. Not because it was weak, but because it was confident. Confidence creates blind spot. The vault was buried deep inside the building, protected by layers of security that made headlines when it was built. Engineers bragged about its thickness. Bank executives bragged about its safety. The vault was so strong that even the police believed no one would ever try to break it directly. That assumption would soon become a fatal mistake. What the bank didn't realize was that someone had already begun asking questions. Quiet questions. Technical questions. Questions about blueprints, construction materials, and maintenance schedules. Questions that didn't sound dangerous until they were connected. Across the street from the bank, offices were rented. Inside those offices, ordinary-looking men came and went. They dressed like businessmen. They carried briefcases. They smiled at neighbors. But inside those rooms, something far more serious was taking shape. Diagrams were drawn, measurements were taken. Every inch of the building was imagined in their minds. They weren't planning to rush the vault. They were planning to live with it. Day after day, week after week, nothing happened. And that was exactly the point. The men waited, knowing that time was their greatest weapon. Every routine that repeated itself made the bank more predictable. Every quiet night confirmed what they already believed: the system was stable, comfortable, and unaware. To the outside world, United California Bank was a fortress. To these men, it was a puzzle with one missing piece, and once that piece was found, everything would fall into place. But even the most carefully planned crime has a beginning, a moment when watching turns into action, a moment when observation becomes commitment. And for the men targeting United California Bank, that moment was coming closer than anyone could imagine, because soon they would stop watching the vault from the outside and begin their move from within. If you want to know how these men were chosen, how trust was built between criminals who knew betrayal meant prison or worse, then stay with this story. Part 2 reveals the men behind the plan, and why this robbery could only be attempted by those who had already survived a lifetime of crime. The men who planned the United California Bank heist were not young, they were not reckless, and they were not chasing fame. These were older criminals, men who had already spent years moving in and out of the shadows, learning hard lessons the easy way had never taught. Each of them had a past, and none of those pasts were clean. Some had served prison time for burglaries and fraud. Others had been involved in smaller bank jobs that failed because someone talked too much or moved too fast. What united them was experience and a deep hatred of mistakes. They had watched younger men get caught because they wanted money quickly. This crew believed in something different: time. Trust among criminals is rare. Most partnerships end in betrayal, panic, or prison. So these men didn't rush into alliances. They met slowly, sometimes months apart, sometimes years. Conversations were careful. Names were not shared easily. No one talked about big plans until everyone had proven they could stay quiet. One of the men had something most criminals never get their hands on: knowledge. He understood construction. He knew how large buildings were designed, where structural weaknesses could exist, and how concrete and steel behaved under pressure. To the rest of the group, this made him invaluable. To the bank, it would become a nightmare. Another member of the group was a logistics expert. He wasn't strong or technical, but he understood systems, how businesses operated, how people followed routines without thinking. He believed every institution, no matter how powerful, eventually revealed its habits. Once you learned those habits, you could predict the future. And then there was the planner. Every serious crime has one. The man who speaks the least but thinks the most. He didn't boast. He didn't threaten. He listened. When others talked about breaking into the vault directly, he shook his head. He knew violence brought attention. Speed brought errors. What they needed was invisibility. United California Bank wasn't chosen because it was weak. It was chosen because it was predictable. The men began by learning everything they could without stepping inside the bank. They studied newspaper articles about the building's construction. They searched for old architectural records. They talked casually with contractors in bars, never asking directly, just listening. Over time, pieces began to form a picture. This wasn't going to be a robbery that lasted minutes. It was going to take months. To get close without suspicion, they rented office space near the bank. Not directly next door, not too far away, just close enough to observe daily patterns. From their windows, they could see employees arriving, guards rotating shifts, cleaning crews leaving late at night. The same people, the same times, every day. The bank staff had no reason to suspect anything. The men across the street looked like businessmen, middle-aged, well-dressed, boring. That was their greatest disguise. Inside the rented offices, the real work began. Diagrams were drawn, distances were measured, timelines were discussed again and again. Every question was challenged, every assumption tested. They argued not emotionally, but intellectually. If someone couldn't explain a decision clearly, it was rejected. Their greatest fear wasn't police. It was each other. One careless word, one moment of impatience, one bad decision could destroy everything. That's why they tested loyalty constantly. If someone arrived late, it was noted. If someone drank too much, they were watched. Discipline wasn't optional, it was survival. Slowly, the plan evolved. They would not enter the bank during business hours, they would not force their way in after closing, and they would not touch the vault until they were certain no alarm would ever be triggered. They weren't planning a robbery, they were planning a presence, a way to work inside the building without anyone realizing it, a method that would allow them to come and go as if nothing was happening. To most criminals, the idea sounded impossible. To these men, it sounded inevitable. But every plan, no matter how careful, eventually faces reality. Walls don't care about intelligence. Concrete doesn't negotiate. And soon, the men would face the hardest question of all: how do you defeat a vault that was never meant to be opened? In Part 3, the planning turns technical. Blueprints are studied. Structural weaknesses are identified. And the crew takes its first irreversible step toward the vault, knowing that from this point forward there would be no turning back. By the time the men committed fully to the plan, they understood one brutal truth: intelligence alone wouldn't open the vault. They needed precision, they needed engineering, and above all, they needed certainty. Part 3 begins where observation ends and calculation takes over. Inside the rented office near United California Bank, the walls slowly disappeared beneath paper. Blueprints, hand-drawn sketches, and carefully measured diagrams were pinned and repinned until every inch of the building lived in their minds. They studied not just the bank, but the earth around it: concrete thickness, load-bearing walls, air gaps, structural joints. Places architects never expected anyone to look twice. The vault itself was buried deep, protected by layers designed to defeat brute force. Thick, reinforced concrete, steel plating. The kind of construction meant to survive earthquakes, not burglars. But concrete, no matter how strong, follows rules. And rules can be exploited if you know them well enough. One of the men had worked construction years earlier. He explained how older vaults were often built in stages, how joints between poured sections could become invisible weaknesses, how a wall that looked solid might hide a seam no thicker than a finger, but enough to make the difference between failure and success. They didn't rush to conclusions. Every idea was tested, argued, and sometimes thrown out entirely. They walked the streets again, counting steps, timing foot traffic, memorizing the soundscape at night. How loud was traffic after midnight? When did the city fall quiet? When did it wake up again? Noise was the enemy. Even a small drilling sound could carry through concrete at night when the city slept. So they researched tools, quiet tools, industrial equipment designed for controlled demolition, modified to reduce vibration and sound. Nothing was purchased hastily. Everything was paid for in cash, from different places, weeks apart. The plan began to narrow. They wouldn't attack the vault door. That was suicide. Too many alarms, too much attention. Instead, they would approach it from the side, from a place no guard ever watched and no alarm protected. A section of wall that shared space with a neighboring area, long forgotten by security designers. To reach it, they would need to work from inside the building, but not the bank itself. That's when the plan crossed a dangerous line. They decided to enter the structure during off hours, not to steal, but to prepare. Small entries, short visits, in and out before dawn. Each visit would look like nothing had changed. No forced doors, no broken locks, just silence. Before attempting anything, they rehearsed mentally again and again. What if a guard changed his route? What if a cleaner stayed late? What if an alarm behaved differently than expected? For every question, there was an answer, or the plan paused until one existed. Weeks passed. From the outside, nothing happened. The bank opened and closed every day. Money flowed in and out. Customers complained about interest rates. Executives felt secure. Inside the rented office, the men reached a quiet agreement. The blueprint phase was over. They had found their point of entry. The wall they intended to breach wasn't famous. It wasn't impressive. It didn't look like a weakness at all. And that was precisely why it was perfect. It lived in a blind spot, a place designed to be ignored. The first cut wouldn't be dramatic. No explosions, no chaos. Just a careful opening, measured in inches, done slowly enough that the building itself wouldn't notice. But once they made that first cut, there would be no turning back. Every drill mark would be a commitment. Every inch removed would tie them tighter to the crime. And while they trusted their calculations, there was still one variable they could never fully control. The night they began the work, the city didn't notice. Traffic thinned, as it always did. Office lights went dark. The rhythm of Los Angeles slowed into its familiar after-midnight quiet. For most people, it was just another ordinary night. For the men targeting United California Bank, it was the moment everything changed. They entered the building not like criminals, but like people who belonged there. No forced doors, no broken locks, no alarms screaming into the night. Each movement was calm, rehearsed, and precise. Their clothing was ordinary, their faces unreadable. Anyone who saw them would have assumed they were maintenance workers finishing a late job. Inside, the air was still. The kind of silence that makes every sound feel louder than it is. They paused often not because they were afraid, but because patience was their discipline. Listening mattered more than speed. They reached the hidden area they had identified weeks earlier. A forgotten space. Bare concrete. No cameras. No guards. Just a wall that looked like every other wall in the building. To anyone else, it meant nothing. To them, it was everything. The first tool came out slowly. No sudden movements. No excitement. The drill had been modified, wrapped, dampened, tested again and again to reduce vibration. Before touching the wall, they waited. 1 full minute. 2, 3, listening. Nothing. The first contact with concrete was gentle. A careful pressure measured to feel how the wall responded. They worked in short intervals, stopping frequently to listen. The building never reacted. No alarms. No footsteps. No voices. They were inside the building, cutting into a bank structure, and no one knew. Progress was slow, painfully slow, inches at a time. Dust was captured immediately, wiped away, before it could settle. Nothing was left behind. When the sun began to hint at rising, they stopped exactly where they were. Tools packed, area cleaned, wall concealed. By morning, nothing appeared different. The bank opened on time. Employees walked past the wall without a second glance. Money moved. Papers were stamped. The world continued, unaware that the building had already been breached. This became their routine. Night after night, they returned. Not every night. Only when conditions were perfect. Holidays? quiet weekends, times when the city slept deeper than usual. Each visit lasted only as long as it had to. They never pushed their luck. Inside the wall, the sound changed. Concrete gave way to deeper resistance. Reinforced sections, steel elements. Every new layer was logged mentally. Adjustments were made. Tools were switched. Always quiet, always controlled. The most dangerous moments weren't when they drilled. They were when they stopped. Every pause invited fear to speak. A distant noise, a passing car, a door closing somewhere in the building. Each sound tested their nerve, but they trusted their planning and, more importantly, they trusted their silence. Weeks passed like this. No headlines, no suspicion, no mistakes. They were closer now, close enough to feel the difference in the wall's temperature, close enough to know what lay beyond it. The vault wasn't visible yet, but its presence was undeniable. Then one night, something changed. As the drill met resistance, the sound shifted slightly, but unmistakably. The wall felt different, hollow in a way concrete never should be. The men froze. They didn't celebrate. They didn't speak. They listened. Nothing happened. Slowly, carefully, they continued. And in that moment, they knew what they had reached. They were no longer working toward the vault. They were touching it.
The final breakthrough didn't come with a sound. It came with a feeling. After weeks of careful work, the wall no longer resisted the way it once had. The drill met a different surface, one that responded with a dull, controlled vibration. The men stopped immediately. Tools were set down. Lights were dimmed. They listened. Nothing. No alarms. No footsteps. No voices echoing through the building. Just the quiet hum of a city far above them, unaware of how close its money was to disappearing. They widened the opening slowly, just enough to see beyond the wall. Cold air met their faces. Then metal, thick, heavy, unmistakable. They had reached the vault. For a moment, no one moved, not out of fear, but respect. This was the heart of the bank, the place designed to never be touched by anyone without permission. And now they were inside its boundary. There was no celebration, no raised voices. Everything they did now mattered more than ever. One careless sound could undo months of discipline. They shifted their focus from concrete to steel. The tools changed again, designed for precision, not force. The vault wall was tough, but it wasn't magic. It followed rules, just like everything else. Rules they had studied for months. The first opening into the vault interior was small, controlled, just enough to confirm what they already suspected. Rows of safe deposit boxes, hundreds of them. Each one represented trust, someone's savings, someone's belief that metal and concrete could protect what mattered most. The men didn't think about the owners. Emotion had no place here. This was work. They didn't open everything. They selected. Boxes were removed carefully, placed into padded containers to avoid noise. Cash bundles, jewelry, gold, documents, items of value that could be moved quickly and quietly. They avoided anything that would slow them down or create questions later. Time moved differently inside the vault. Minutes felt like seconds. Seconds felt like hours. They worked with calm efficiency, never rushing, never stopping too long. Every movement had been rehearsed in their minds long before this night. When the containers were full, they didn't stay. That was the mistake amateurs made greed. The belief that one more box wouldn't matter. These men knew better. The longer you stay, the closer you get to failure. They sealed the opening temporarily, not permanently, just enough to hide what they had done. Tools were cleaned, gloves removed. Everything was packed the same way it had arrived. By the time dawn approached, they were gone. The bank opened as usual. Customers stood in line. Clerks smiled politely. Managers checked reports. No one noticed anything wrong. The vault stood silently behind its walls, appearing as secure as ever. Hours passed. Then days. Only when bank officials performed a deeper internal inspection did the truth begin to surface. Something wasn't right. A wall didn't look the way it should. Measurements didn't match records. Panic spread quietly before exploding into full alarm. Millions were missing. The discovery sent shockwaves through the bank, the city, and law enforcement. This wasn't a smash and grab. This was something far worse, a professional job that made the system look foolish. But while the world reacted, the men were already thinking ahead. Because escaping the vault was only half the crime. Keeping the money and staying free would be far more dangerous. In Part 6, investigators enter the scene. The FBI is called in, and the smallest detail, something the robbers never expected, begins to pull the entire operation toward exposure. The discovery didn't come with sirens or shouting. It came with confusion. Inside United California Bank, senior staff gathered around the vault as measurements were taken again and again. Something was wrong, but no one could explain how. Walls don't move on their own. Vaults don't lose contents without alarms. Yet the evidence was undeniable. By the end of the day, the FBI was called. Federal agents arrived quietly, notebooks in hand, expressions unreadable. This wasn't a robbery in the traditional sense. There were no broken locks, no forced doors, no triggered alarms. To the Bureau, that meant one thing: professionals. Investigators began by walking the crime scene slowly. Every inch of the vault was examined. Dust patterns, tool marks, structural changes so subtle they could be missed by anyone not trained to look for them. And soon they found it. A wall that wasn't supposed to open. The entry point shocked even seasoned agents. The precision of the cut, the lack of damage, the discipline it took to pull this off without setting off a single alarm. Whoever did this understood construction, security, and human behavior. But even perfect crimes leave shadows. Agents expanded the investigation outward beyond the vault. They reviewed building access logs, maintenance schedules, rental records for nearby offices. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Offices had been leased close to the bank by men who left almost no trace. Almost. One rental agreement stood out. Paid in cash. Minimal background information. No long-term business activity. The office had been vacated soon after the robbery. That was enough. Surveillance began not at the bank, but on the suspects. Phone records were reviewed. Financial behavior was analyzed. The problem wasn't that the men spent too much. It was that they spent differently. Large cash purchases, sudden lifestyle changes, vehicles paid for outright, movements that didn't match reported income. Each detail alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a picture. The FBI moved carefully. They didn't rush arrests. They wanted proof. They followed quietly, watching the men grow comfortable. Confidence is dangerous. It makes people careless. And then came the mistake. One member of the group attempted to move a portion of the stolen items through a contact he trusted. The contact talked, not immediately, not loudly, but enough. Once the first thread was pulled, the rest unraveled quickly. Search warrants followed. Safe houses were raided. Hidden containers were uncovered. Cash, jewelry, documents traced back to the vault. The evidence stacked up faster than the men could react. Arrests were made calmly. No dramatic chases, no shootouts. Just doors opening and lives changing forever. In court, the details stunned the public. The method, the patience, the months of preparation. United California Bank had been defeated not by force, but by intelligence. Some of the stolen money was recovered. Not all of it. Sentences were handed down. Years behind bars for men who had believed they could outthink the system. And for a while, it seemed like the story was over. But the real legacy of the heist wasn't the money. It was what it exposed. Banks across the country re-evaluated their security. Vault designs changed. Procedures tightened. The crime became a case study, a warning. Because the United California Bank Heist proved something unsettling. The strongest walls don't fail from the outside. They fail from within. If you want more true crime stories like this, real robberies, real investigations, and the lessons they left behind, like the video, subscribe to the channel and comment which historic crime you want next.